The reality is there's no real training for being a solution architect. I mean, there's certifications, fine. No one trained you for when you design something and you get pushed back on, you know? No one trains you on, we have to do this in a week. And you're looking at, you're like, this is going to take a month minimum. No one trains you on when the project manager is like, oh, you're 2 weeks past deadline. Why is it not moving? No one trains you on when like you put something into your designs, but when you actually start building it, you realize that it's not going to work as you thought. So these are the 5 roles personally I've discovered that's helped me go from, being a cloud engineer to not only being a solution architect, but being a senior solution architect.
This is our friend Fayomi, also known as Cloud Career Mentor. He was the first ever guest on this podcast, and he's returning to share some incredible insight on another topic. Fayomi is an experienced cloud solutions architect who mentors people to gain insight into the tech industry on his channel, Cloud Career Mentor. But in this episode, you will learn what a cloud solutions architect is and how it differs from cloud engineer roles. You will learn the rules and steps to becoming a great cloud solutions architect. And you'll also learn about Fayomi's journey with one of his most crazy and incredible stories working in this role. Please enjoy this video. You've worked as a cloud engineer as well as a cloud solutions architect. And we get so many questions about working as a cloud solutions architect. Sometimes it's from people who are not in the tech industry yet. Sometimes it's for people who are already working in cloud. And you, as someone who's worked in this industry, we want to dive into that a lot in this episode. So we can start off by asking the question, what is a cloud solutions architect?
That is a great question. And first of all, I want to say there's a lot of misconceptions about what a solution architect actually is. Some people think a solution architect just draws architectural diagrams. Some people think, they only attend sales calls and talk to customers, or they only use the latest technology. And these are misconceptions because a solution architect is simply someone who understands the business needs and requirements and solves them using technology. So some example of some business requirements or problems are maybe we need to do a migration from the data center to the cloud, or maybe our cloud platform is really expensive. How can we optimize the cost? Or maybe, we're really scared of security breaches. How can we improve our security? So these are just some of the technological problems a business faces, and a solution architect develops technical solutions to them.
That makes a lot of sense. And I suppose the confusion comes from what the difference is between cloud solutions architect and cloud engineer. I mean, like me starting out as a cloud engineer working in cloud, a lot of people that follow this channel are people who look at that cloud engineer role, but they also see cloud solutions architect coming up a lot when they're searching for roles. And so what is the difference between a cloud solutions architect and a cloud engineer?
That's a great question. And I want us to think of it let's assume there's 2 types of cloud jobs. So in one bucket, we have roles like cloud engineer, DevOps engineer. I think most companies use these names interchangeably. So if you see cloud engineer or DevOps engineer, you're basically doing the same thing. In the second bucket, you have the solution architect job title. Now, this is different. And I want you to think of it in terms of, when you're building a house, right? So you want to build a new house, you got some money, and your first step is you hire an architect. And what the architect does is they understand what you need for the house, how many rooms you want, how many bedrooms and bathrooms, what the size is. And then they go away and they draw a diagram of what your house could look like. And, through feedback and iterations, you perfect it. And at the end, you have some blueprints of, okay, perfect. This is what the house should look like. And then once that is done, you then hand it over to like a bricklayer or general contractor who then builds the house. So in the tech scenario, the solution architect is like the traditional architect. So they understand what your needs are. And then based on that, they draw the diagrams to make that happen. And then the cloud engineer or DevOps engineer usually are the ones who build it. So they're the ones who are actually writing the Terraform. They're the ones who are actually like clicking around in the console or doing what needs to be done. So just to clarify, solution architect is all about thinking about the problem, designing the solution, whereas DevOps engineer or cloud engineer is all about building or implementing that solution.
That's a great description of the two roles. One thing that I want to ask about that is is it required to work as a cloud engineer, DevOps engineer, or other sort of engineer before then becoming a solutions architect? As you said, you're as an architect, you're designing the thing, but if you don't know the thing, how can you design it? So, is it a requirement to be an engineer before being an architect?
So that's a great question. And here's the truth about the tech industry in general is that there aren't really any roles. They're just strong recommendations. So theoretically, you could become a solution architect from maybe you come from a software engineering background, or maybe you come from other things. But what I would say is that it's very rare. And here's why. As a solution architect, the decisions you're making could either make or cost the company millions of dollars or pounds. If you design the solution wrong, it could lead to all sorts of problems. And so the stakes are really high. And so if you're coming from, let's say, a non technical background, for example, let's say you're a teacher or you work in a factory or whatever, and you dream of becoming a solution architect, chances are, no matter how many certifications you've done, no matter how many hands-on projects you've done, chances are you're not going to get a job as a solution architect. The traditional route is if you've worked in the cloud industry as a cloud engineer, as a DevOps engineer, something like that. Because when you're designing the solution, and I'm sure like your listeners probably encountered this. Let's say you want to do a project, and you look at the documentation, and it looks really easy. I want to create a VPC, I want to create a web server. It looks really easy, and then when you actually start building it, you realize, oh, actually, this command isn't working for some reason, or this service works a bit different from how it looks. And the more you build, the more you realize there's a lot of like nuances and things like that. And so your experience as a cloud engineer or DevOps engineer, you start to see those nuances and you start to understand, oh, for this project, we could use, I don't know, an RDS relational database, but I know based on what the customer needs that maybe DynamoDB NoSQL is better. Um, and a lot of this just comes with years of experience and training and things like that. And so that's why most solution architect roles are usually reserved for those who've spent like a couple of years in the cloud industry, because they're more likely to understand those nuances than someone's just coming in fresh.
That makes a lot of sense, and it's in line with what I've typically seen. When I've looked at solutions architect roles or cloud solutions architect roles specifically, it's usually required years working as an engineer, or it's saying that the requirements or the things you need to know are things that you should know as an engineer, and then moving on into those roles. But there are also those unique roles that particularly large companies like Amazon or Microsoft have, where they kind of hire solutions architects out of university and train them over a number of months and years to be able to fulfill those roles. So they're super rare, but particularly
Yeah.
those large companies, they have those sort of roles.
And that's a great thing to bring up because like you mentioned, they're super rare. And people see that and think, oh, they hired this person from a graduate scheme. Oh, they can do that. But what I found with those roles is that don't there's this quote I like where, we all know someone who like works a 9 to 5, they make a lot of money, they spend a lot of time with family and friends, they go to the gym, and they just seem like they have the perfect life. I assume that is not you. Like most of us aren't like super gifted or super lucky. Most jobs aren't jobs at Amazon. That's just the reality of it. Most jobs are small to mid-sized companies who are very, very conscious about how they spend their money and who they hire. So Amazon can afford to hire like, someone brand new because they just have so much business. They just need it. But most companies, most people you're going to be interviewing for, they want to make sure if they're hiring someone. And here's another interesting point about solution architect roles as well. They pay really well. That's just the reality of it. And the reason they pay really well is because, like I mentioned before, the stakes are higher. And sometimes I get people, they come to me, they're like, "Oh, I'll work for you for free as a solution architect." These are people who don't have any experience. They're trying to break into the industry and they're like, "I'll work for free. I'll do whatever." And I'm like, you working for me for free is still too expensive, because if you make a mistake, you could bring down the whole business. You could bring down, so it's still too expensive. Like, most companies would rather pay someone $100,000 and they know that that person's good than to get someone in for like free or cheap. Because yeah, if you mess up, if you delete a database by accident, if you don't design something right, like it could become really expensive for them. So that's just something to bear in mind as well.
Those are some great points, and so true, and I love the way you've explained it. Now we're talking about paths to becoming cloud solutions architects. I wanted to hear a lot more about your path and your journey, and how you went from getting into tech all the way to becoming a cloud solutions architect. So tell us about your journey.
Awesome. So I think my story is sort of a two-pronged approach, because the first stage is how I actually got my first job as a cloud engineer. And I'll sort of like fast forward through that. And then I'll talk about how I went from being a cloud engineer to being a solution architect. So how I got my first job as a cloud engineer, I came from a non-technical background. I studied geography, and, I just over time developed an interest in tech. And through a period of trial and error over a number of years, I started building projects. I learned the Linux command line. I decided to create web servers. I heard about this thing called AWS where you can host your web servers. So I signed up. I deployed some EC2 web servers into the cloud, and I just sort of built my skills over time. I decided to learn Python, and I didn't really have a roadmap or anything. I was just kind of like pursuing interests and like breadcrumbs, and it was super unstructured, and it took me a number of years, but eventually I got my first job in the cloud industry. And because I had built in a habit of learning, because I was just like working on this stuff every day, every day, every day, as soon as I got my first job, I was like, great, now let's accelerate that. So before I got my first job, I didn't have any certifications. And this is something I was like, do I need certifications? It helps, but I didn't have any. And so my company paid for me to get my solution architect associate and my cloud practitioner. And so, the first year I was kind of just finding my feet, completing projects, things like that. And then after the first year, I kind of could figure out what was going on. And I was like, okay, now I need to really like improve my skills. And that's when I just started doing certification after certification. I think I've done 9 AWS certifications now. And I also started volunteering myself for projects, right? So anything, the jobs no one else wanted to do, the jobs that were too difficult, I just put my hand up like, yep, I'm up for that. Because what that did was that helped me to come out of my comfort zone. And one of the key things of being a solution architect is knowing how to think about problems. Like, when you're a cloud engineer, you're just doing, oh, someone had you create this thing, you're just doing. And that's great. And something I did, when I was still like a cloud engineer, I looked at solutions architect. I was like, what are you guys doing? Like, it seems so easy. You're like, cause I'm like, oh, yeah, I can build this stuff. What are you guys doing? And it wasn't until like, you know, 3-ish years later, this is just me building my skills, getting certifications, developing, that I landed a job as just like as a solution architect. And I didn't really know what I was doing, really, like, because you go from being told what to do to deciding on to being the one making those decisions. And those are two very different places, because like when you start, you think building, oh, it's really difficult. You're trying to figure out all these things, but there's so many skills that come into being a solution architect.
We have some big news. It's been a long time coming, but the tech certified community is finally live on Discord. This is a space where tech professionals and aspiring tech professionals have come together. Imagine a space where you can ask questions, share ideas, and learn something new every day from different people. The community is growing fast. There's so much collaborative learning going on. We're having weekly video calls. And the best part about this community is that it is completely free. So what are you waiting for? The link is in the description of this video. Go and join the tech certified community. Let's get right back to the podcast.
And if you don't mind, I'd like to talk about sort of the 5 rules I've discovered in my journey on how you can become a solution architect. So, I love a framework. So these are the 5 rules personally I've discovered that's helped me go from, being a cloud engineer to not only being a solution architect, but being a senior solution architect. And let's dive into it. So the first one is you need to understand the well-architected framework. Now, I'm sure you've heard of this, Caleb. Yeah. For those who haven't heard of this, they're basically, and this is cloud agnostic. I've seen it in Microsoft Azure. I've seen it in AWS, and I'm sure it's in Google Cloud as well. But this framework is basically the 5 or 6 things you need to think about when designing architecture. And I'll just list them out. So one is security, then there's cost optimization, there's reliability, there's operational excellence, there's performance efficiency, and then there's sustainability. Now, these 6 things are key because once you understand them, you start to think of designing architecture in a different way. So, for example, I got given this project where I had to design a sort of a web server, for example. So, as a cloud engineer, your instinct are just to build straight away. So I was like, great, we'll get an EC2 instance going. We'll install WordPress or Apache. We'll get the database going. But then I realized that that wasn't right because I wasn't considering a lot of things. So let's look at security as the first one. So, okay, I have this web server. It needs to have good security. So most times, most cloud engineers default deploy into a public subnet. I mean, I'm sure some cloud engineers don't even know the difference in public and private, but taking a step back and thinking about security, I'm like, oh, it'll be better for me to deploy this in a private subnet because it's less accessible from who we don't want it to be. So that's the way I've gone from, okay, now it's in a public subnet to security, private subnet. Great. First step. And there's a lot that goes into it, but I'm just going to keep it simple. Yeah. Next, we look at cost optimization. Initially, I think, oh yeah, just whack it on a big EC2 instance. But I'm like, okay, by monitoring the metrics or by understanding the usage, I can see that it actually needs a smaller instance than I thought we would do. So using that as a consideration to, okay, what instance type do we actually use here? Then we have something like reliability. So again, as a cloud engineer, I build it, it's done, great. But now I'm like, oh, maybe I should start thinking of things like what happens if the web server goes down, right? Like, do we have any auto scaling that spins a new one? Do we have any backup or disaster recovery that, so if something happens, we can recover? Next is like operational excellence. Okay, if we want to update this, do I just SSH on the server and do it? Or should we create some sort of pipeline to make deploying to the server easier and better? And then we look at something like sustainability to make sure, oh, can we do this in a more carbon friendly way? And that sort of feeds it into like cost and things like that. But you can see how we've taken a problem that your initial instinct, because as a cloud engineer, you just want to build stuff. So your initial instinct is just start building. But when you take a step back and start thinking, okay, what's the security of this? How can we make this more cost optimized? How can we make this more scalable and reliable? And you can see, you can start thinking a bit broader. So that's sort of the first thing you need to understand, the well-architected framework. The second thing is you need to understand migration strategies, because the reality as a solution architect, like migration is a big part of that, both from something like on-premises to the cloud, or even just migration within the cloud. So you're using, maybe you're using EC2, but you want to move to serverless, or you just want to reconfigure things. And there are 6, I believe, migration strategies. And I'll just, again, briefly run through them. The first is rehost or lift and shift. So it's like, okay, we have a virtual machine running in a data center. We're just going to take it as it is and just create a virtual machine in the cloud. So, for example, like an EC2 instance. So, super simple. You're just replicating what you have. The next is the replatform. So, that's the lift, tinker, and shift. So, an example would be let's say you have a database, for example, and it's a MySQL database. So you could have it where you have the database running in the virtual machine in your data center. And you could, if you were to, let's say you were rehosting it, you'd spin up an EC2 instance and just put the database on. So it's very similar. But if you're replatforming, you're like, okay, we have this managed service called RDS. So I'm just going to replatform it a bit. I'm going to tweak it a bit, and it's still MySQL, but we replatform. Next is repurchasing. So, which is where you move to a different product. So let's say, again, you have the MySQL, which is a relational database, but after you or actually a better example is I've seen a lot of the time is with databases you could have like a Microsoft SQL database, you're running that on premises, and then you're looking to move into the cloud and you realize that, oh, actually, like the Microsoft licensing costs they're really high, and seeing as we're doing this move, it's an opportunity for us to use an open source thing like MySQL. So you go from like a Microsoft SQL database to a MySQL database in the cloud. So that's an example of repurchasing. Then the next migration strategy is refactoring or re-architecting. So this is where you actually rethink how an application is developed and deployed. Again, so you have the data center and you have like a web server that runs on a virtual machine. But you look at your application and you think, this actually works as an API. So we can leverage some serverless technologies here. And you think, okay, I can either just move the application from a virtual machine to an EC2, which would be a form of rehosting, or I can replatform it because now I can get AWS API gateway as the gateway endpoint. I can use Lambda as the compute, and actually we'll save a lot of money by doing that. And so that's an example of refactoring. So you refactor your code. The fifth thing you can do is you can retire a service. So, an interesting thing that happens when you're doing something like a migration is that you take stock of all the applications, all the services, all the databases, and you're like, okay, what do we actually have? And you might realize that, oh, there's this database. No one knows what it is. It's not really in use. We've just been paying for it. We don't actually need to bring it to the new environment. So you might just choose to retire that database. Okay, we'll just shut it down and forget about it. And the final migration thing you can do is to retain, which is to leave it as is and not do anything. And this
Right.
usually happens when you're doing a migration in phases. For example, you could be like, okay, we have 10 applications we need to move. For now, let's just move five of the applications, like the simple ones, and the other five are quite complex. So let's just leave it for now. We'll look at those in a year's time or something. So yeah, those are the six strategies for understanding migration strategies. The third thing, so I'll just recap. The first thing you need to understand to be a great architect is understand a well architected framework. The second thing is understand the different migration strategies. Now, the third thing you need to understand is how to make architectural decisions. Now, this involves things like when do you do a self-hosted service versus say a managed service? When do you choose between going serverless or non-serverless? So just having rubrics, and I have certain frameworks where I know if this, then Lambda, if that, then EC2. So just understanding how to make those decisions between like a relational database, non-relational database. And this just comes with experience, and this comes with like understanding the different services. And this is very, very important. The fourth thing is understanding the different phases of a project workflow. So if I use the migration as an example, all right, we have a migration to do. What are the steps to go from, okay, everything is on premises to now everything is in AWS or the cloud? And as a solution architect, I feel like you need to understand what those are. And what I found is that there are four key phases. Now, before I talk about that, not as a solution architect, you're not going to do all those phases. So, for example,
Right.
if you're in a big company like AWS, you probably do one or two. If you're in a smaller company, you probably do all four. But so the four phases are this: phase one, the requirements gathering phase. Now, before you do anything, you have to understand what are the requirements, what are we trying to achieve, what are the, so if we say with the migration, it's like, okay, we need to migrate like 50 services. Okay, what are the services? How much compute and resources are they using at the moment? What are their backup and disaster recovery? What first we map out what all the services are, but also what are we trying to achieve by moving to the cloud? Are we trying to reduce latency? Are we trying to reduce cost? Are we trying to increase resilience? Like, what are we actually trying to achieve? And so, by understanding what the requirements are, it will help you when you start thinking about a solution. So once you understand the requirements, next you do the target or design phase. So, okay, phase one, get the requirements. Phase two, now let's actually think through what the solution will be. So, okay, are these applications going to be serverless? Are they going to be server? Are they going to be managed services? So you sort of start to research solutions. And this is where, this is the bit everyone knows, which is where, okay, now we're going to start drawing the diagrams. But as you can
Right.
see, you can't draw the diagrams until you understand what you're trying to achieve. So yeah, phase two, do some research, you draw some diagrams, and you go back to your customer or the stakeholders, you present it to them, and they give you feedback. And through a process of iteration, you have something that everybody's happy with. The third phase is the project planning phase, which is very key because okay, now we know what the problem is. Now we have a potential solution. Now we need to actually map out the journey. And again, this is what separates solutions architects from cloud engineers because as a cloud engineer, all right, cool, let's start building it. We've got a solution, let's start building. But as a solution architect, you understand there's other business constraints. So for example, the key stakeholders like the project manager or the CEO, CTO, whoever you're reporting to, they want to know how long is it going to take to make this happen? They want to know how much is it going to cost to make it happen. They want to know how much developer time is going to get tied up in this. These are all the things they want to know. And there's usually like a deadline, like, okay, we need to do this in a month or we need to do this in 3 months. And so this is where you have to actually plan it out. So you're like, and and again, this is a whole thing, so I'll just high level it. And the idea is you go, okay, what are all the things that need to happen? Okay, we need to create a VPC, we need to create this pipeline, we need to move this data. You list out all the tasks, and then like in a spreadsheet, and then you then assign who's responsible for this. So is this going to be a job for a cloud engineer? Is this going to be a job for the software engineer? Is this going to be a job who's so for example, cloud engineers generally don't touch the application code. So it might be like, okay, we need to move this application from EC2 to Lambda. So it could be like, okay, cloud engineer creates the Lambda, and then the software engineer refactors their code to make sure it works with Lambda. So you can see there's different. So yeah, you list out, okay, what are the things that needs to be happen? Who needs to do each of those things? Are there any dependencies? So for example, let's say, if you're migrating a database, you have to create the new database before you can migrate the old one to it. So you look at what needs to happen that could potentially be a problem. So you make sure you're doing things in the right order. So these are some of the things. And also the final thing is you put an estimation of how long each of those tasks are going to take. So let's say create a VPC, that'll take 2 hours, create a database, that'll take another 2 hours, migrate the data from one to another, that'll be like a day. And so at the end of that exercise, you should be able to look and go, okay, this project is going to take 2 weeks, or this project is going to take 6 months. And then you can go to your stakeholders and tell them why and sort of do that. So yeah, you plan it. And the final is the project execution phase where you actually start building it. And like I mentioned, if you're like in a big company, maybe you're just worried about the requirements gathering and the solution architecture design. I don't really worry about the planning or the execution. But if you're working in smaller companies where you're more hands-on with the whole process, you might be doing all four. and there might be like a project manager who does some of it. But I always like to tell people that to be good, you want to know all those phases, because even though I think ultimately if you design something, you're responsible for it. And so, you can't just palm it off to someone else like, all right, good luck, guys. I think to be really good, you need to understand, you need to be able to see it from start to conclusion. The final thing, which is the fifth thing you need to understand if you want to become a solution architect, is to learn how to communicate effectively. Now, what do I mean? You need to know the difference between communicating with a technical person, let's say a software engineer, and a non technical person like the CEO or someone in a leadership position. Because what I found a lot of the time is like cloud engineers or technical people, they talk to everyone technically. So the CEO would say something like, "Oh, when is this migration gonna be done?" And then the cloud engineer will be like, "Oh, we have to move the database and we have to modify the SQL statements to do this, and we have to the code needs to work like this." And I'm like, the CEO doesn't care about that. All they want to hear is, "It'll be ready in 2 weeks," you know, and but it's like we need to, and I see this a lot. So when you're talking to non-technical people, appreciate they don't care about the details. They just want to know, when is it going to be ready? Do you need any help? That's it. And another way you should communicate is learn how to create presentations, because again, solution architecture usually like a senior person, so you're communicating with senior people. You need to know how to create presentations that outlines your vision. You need to know how to write documentation, because you're going to be gathering requirements and documenting all of these things. But more importantly, you need to know how to be persuasive, because I've worked on projects where I'm like, because I've worked in consultancy basically my whole career. So I'd have a client and I'd be talking to the CTO and I'd be like, I think for this project we need to go serverless, or we need to go serverless because of A, B, and C. And they're like, "Oh, our application can't go serverless because of X, Y, and Z." And then I'm like, "I understand how your application works, and I've done a proof of concept, and I can prove to you that we can do this." And then they like, "Oh, okay," because your job is, you're the expert, so
Yeah.
you need to know how to. And other people might not see what you see just because they don't have the experience you do, so they're thinking of it in the old way. So you need to know how to convince them, but then there's a flip side to that coin as well, where you need to know when to take that feedback on board. So, there's certain databases where I'm like, okay, we can move it to RDS, which is a managed service because of X, Y, and Z. But then when we're talking to them, we realize that, oh, the database has to do something with the CPU of the virtual machine or the server. So it needs that. But if it's an RDS, with RDS, you don't have access to the CPU. And so you're like, okay, cool. We can't do this on RDS. We'll put it on EC2 instead. It's not ideal, but because of how the database works at this point, and maybe in the future, we'll see how we can work around that. So it's a skill to know how to be persuasive and push back, versus how to go, actually, that's right. And that comes with just knowledge, and that comes with confidence. But I'd say, Caleb, something I've seen that stops a lot of people from becoming solution architects is that they don't speak up, you know. So if there's a meeting and that's like, what do you guys think, they keep quiet, the reality, because they're scared, oh, maybe am I going to say the wrong thing, or maybe I'm not quite sure. And what I found is the people who speak up are the ones who get promoted, you know because if you don't speak up, then no one knows what no one knows anything. So you have to be speaking up, suggesting ideas, just making yourself heard. Because even if you're wrong, like, no one's going to judge you. It's just a conversation. So someone else might give something, and you balance it out, but you need to be part of the conversation. And I've seen it so many times. So just to reiterate, because we've
Yeah.
talked
Yeah.
about a lot of things, the 5 things you need to become a great solution architect are: one, understand the well architected framework; two, understand the different migration strategies; three, understand how to make good architectural decisions; four, understand the project workflow, the different phases of a project; and five, learn how to communicate effectively.
Wow, wow, that was an incredible roadmap, I'd say, of those things you need to know and understand to become a cloud solutions architect or to work as a cloud solutions architect. And it was super interesting for me just sitting back and listening to you. Um, as an engineer and having worked as an engineer, there's lots of things that I noticed and picked up and was like, okay, this is something I don't do as an engineer, something I don't understand as an engineer. But in moving forward in the future and getting promoted, these are things that I'll have to know and understand. I thought about the well architected framework and the pillars, and there's certain things that as an engineer you wouldn't think about. Like it's not likely that you're thinking about cost optimization and sustainability when you're deploying an EC2 or working on that sort of stuff. It's not likely that you're thinking about that. There's someone else that's thought about that already and has handed that down. And thinking about project management. As an engineer, you're at the bottom of that project doing it, just implementing. But there's loads of steps that you've already gone through to get to that point of execution. And another really interesting thing that you said, which I didn't really fully know, is that there are solutions architects that are involved in the execution, which is quite surprising. So are there solutions architects that are involved in execution? Is this a common thing, or what's the most likely way this works?
Yeah, I think it really all depends on the size of the organization you're in. So if you're in an organization where there's one solution architect and one cloud engineer and it's a small team, guess what? You're going to get your hands dirty. And I've done this a lot, a number of times, because your job as a solution architect, you're just like the lead of it, but the work still needs to get done. But I also have colleagues, and I know people in like sort of larger organization where all they do is gather requirements, draw the architecture, and then just throw it over the wall to the cloud engineers who are going to build. I've worked in those environments as well. So I'd say it all depends on the size of the company you're in. What I would say though is I actually think it's better to get yourself in an environment where you're seeing a project all the way through. Because again, for me, I'm always thinking, how can I be the best at this? And if you're in a situation where you're designing and you're throwing it over the wall, when those problems happen, you're sort of insulated from it. You don't know how your design really implements things. But if you see the project all the way through, you can be like, oh, I designed it this way, but when we were building it, like this thing happened that I didn't really consider. And but when you get used to seeing things all the way through, it just makes you better because you can start thinking ahead more and being like, oh, okay, this thing I thought would take us like 2 hours. I forgot that in this sort of environment, we need to get sign off from all of these people. So we should have added an extra day to that because we can't start this without getting sign off from that person. And so to answer your question, you can be in environments where either happens, but I always say get yourself to a place where you can see it all the way through. And then, you feel more confident in your abilities. And then, if you're in a situation where you're just handing it off, then that's fine too.
Very cool and very, very interesting. I wanted to move on to another question. And the question is, what mistakes are people making as maybe engineers or other roles that is stopping them from moving into solutions architect roles?
That's a great question and one I love to answer. So I'd say the most common, the most egregious mistake is people thinking they can go from a career where they had no previous technical background to becoming a solution architect.
Mm,
And I think this is really, really difficult because, you have certifications like the AWS Solutions Architect certification.
yeah.
So you take that, you think, oh, I've done this. Now I'm a solution architect. And I think a lot of people are misled. They're told that, oh, yeah, do this thing and you can become a solution architect. And that's just, as we've talked about today, that's not realistic because almost by definition, a solution architect is quite a senior position because of the stakes involved. And so I usually tell people, look, if you're trying to break into this industry, try to get a job as a cloud engineer or a DevOps engineer first. And this was a big topic of our previous conversation. So if you're interested in, okay, what do I need to do to become a cloud engineer, then definitely watch that. I'm sure links will be somewhere in the show notes.
Yeah.
So that's the first mistake, people trying to get a job as a solution architect with no previous experience. The second mistake is people think, so those who are in jobs as like cloud engineers or DevOps engineers, we think, oh, if I just work harder, if I just get technically better, I will be promoted. And again, that's not how it works. Yes, you have to know what you're doing. You need to know the technical stuff, but you also need to develop those skills of communication and leadership and just putting yourself out there. And so a lot of people just bury themselves in the work and they never speak up and they never get noticed, which is unfortunate. So because a big part of being a solution architect, like I said, is talking to stakeholders, maybe talking to CEOs, CTOs, getting consensus amongst different groups of people. So being able to demonstrate those communication and those leadership skills is very, very important. So that's the second mistake. The third mistake is people don't improve their skills, like, so to sort of highlight what we've talked about, they don't learn about the well architected framework, they don't learn about the different migration strategies, they don't learn how to make architectural decisions. I guess to summarize this point, they just do what they're told, you know, they just do the projects they're given. And this is common. You have to do in your own time. You have to be upskilling. You have to be learning all these other things. You have to be improving yourself. I mean, when I was a cloud engineer, yeah, I do my hours, but guess what? Every day after work, I do like an extra hour or two, like my own study, nothing to do with work. Maybe working towards a certification or building my own project. Just you have to be doing something outside your regular 9 to 5 because that's how you take yourself to that next level. So I'd say those are the three mistakes people make in their journey.
Wow. Yeah, no, that's incredible. I appreciate that. And the vibe I'm getting from, just speaking about this role is that it is a role that involves lots of understanding, number one, and experience, and also involves a lot of communication at high level with lots of stakeholders. It's almost being an engineer, project manager, and architect all at once. And I think this kind of makes a lot of sense as we see the solutions architect role and we see like the salary that comes with it, and it makes a lot of sense the reason that salary is so high. I mean, people, like you said, might look at it and think, oh no, they're just creating this diagram, this must be really easy, like, and they're getting paid the six figures, these crazy amounts, and not really understand why they're getting paid that much, what is involved in actually doing the role. I feel like anyone who's watched this video up to this point understands that now. So it's an amazing explanation that you've given. And even for myself, I understand the role of a cloud solutions architect so much more than I did 40 minutes ago.
if it's all right, I could add one more to that because, like, I really like what you're saying about seeing the salaries and seeing what goes on behind. And one thing I haven't mentioned actually is the sense of responsibility and pressure. And I think that's one of those things that's not talked about a lot because the reality is there's no real training for being a solution architect. I mean, there's certifications, fine, but no one trained you for when you design something and you get pushed back on,
Mm.
No one trains you on, we have to do this. We have to do this in a week. And you're like, this is going to take a month minimum. No one trains you on when the project manager is like, oh, you're 2 weeks past deadline. Why is it not moving? No one trains you on when, like, you put something in your designs, but when you actually start building it, you realize that it's not going to work as you thought. And it's a lot of pressure. And you're ultimately responsible because guess what? You designed this. So, fix it.
Yep.
And no one really trains you on that. And so I find most people in solution architect roles, we're just kind of like figuring it out. We're just kind of like, we're just literally taking it one day at a time. I remember one of my colleagues when I was a consultant, on his very first day on the job, this was like a relatively small consultancy. On his very first day on the job, they like sent him to a client site, like, cool, welcome, go. And he's like, oh, not to mention, like, you need to know all these technologies. You need to know not only the cloud, you need to know Terraform, you need to know CI/CD, you need to know all these. And guess what? The client might be using a different tech stack to you. I need to like figure that out quickly. And so there's a lot of pressure that goes on. And so, when you see I think anytime anyone sees something where there's high salary and it looks easy, just know that there's a lot that's happening that you're not seeing. And if it was easy, the salary won't be high. Let's put it that way. So that's just something to bear in mind. But I say this not to discourage people. I say this to encourage people to be better, because I think we all like take the path of least resistance. We're all like, okay, what's the least I can do to achieve my goals? And the challenge I'm setting is, all right, cool. How can I be better? What do I need to do? How can I improve myself? How can I upskill myself? Like, if this is what you want, if it's not what you want, that's cool. But it's always like, okay, how can I be better? And that's basically what I'm trying to get across. That if you want to do that, start thinking, okay, how can I be better?
Makes so much sense, and I really appreciate that explanation. Even just talking about how if you see the salary and it's high, there's a reason that it's like that. There's a lot of work that's going to go into it, and there's a lot of experience that is likely behind that role. Um, but to move on, I wanted to jump into my favorite question, and we didn't get the opportunity to have this question in our last one because it was the first ever episode and I hadn't started doing this. But I want to hear your most memorable career story. Maybe it's as a solutions architect or even an engineer, but your most memorable career story that you faced, whether it's a good thing that's happened or maybe it's bad. I've had some crazy stories on this show.
Okay,
So what
now
is your most memorable?
I have the perfect one for you. So this is the story of when I became officially like cloud engineer slash junior solution architect, to when I was like, okay, I'm a solution architect now. And this is when I was like, let's say I'm like 2.5 years into my cloud career at this point, and me and a colleague are working on like a big project for the government. It's like a big migration project. And it cost, let's say the cost of this project is about £750,000. And so it's just me and my colleague, and my colleague is senior. And so, I'm just there chilling because I'm like, I'm the junior guy here. My colleague, he got this. And so me and him, we're going to all the clients meetings, we're gathering the requirements, and I'm like, I'm just happy to be there. I'm just happy to help. And this is a project that was going to take like 3 months. And 3 weeks into the project, the client was like, this scene, they went to the management, was like, this colleague that I've been working with, he's not quite right for this role. You guys need to get rid of him. And at this point, because I've been the only other person on this project, so my other senior colleague was sort of removed from the project. And then all of a sudden, now I'm in charge of the project. And so at this point, I go from being just like in the background, just chilling, or someone else. Now I'm responsible for the success of this project, and it's huge. It's like the biggest thing I've ever worked on in my career. So now I'm leading all the calls with the key stakeholders. I'm making the architectural decisions, and I'm having to like really think about, oh, what we're gonna do. I'm doing all the proof of concepts. And it was at this phase where I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. Like, I'm going to my manager, like, this is difficult. Like, and but they encouraged me. I think they did a really good job. They're like, look, you can do this. Maybe they brainstorm some things with me, but like, it was my project. And so, one way or the other, you're creating ideas, you're sharing it, you're doing proof of concepts, you're sharing it. I'm having conversations with the key stakeholders. And I remember at a point, I'm like, okay, I feel like I'm actually know what I'm doing. I feel like the key stakeholders, and these are very senior people, and I must have been like, I don't know, like 26 or something, and I'm holding meetings and I'm showing them, they're asking me questions, I'm answering. And I remember we keep going and, they're happy. They're like, okay, the project is moving. Whereas before it kind of stalled. And one way or the other, I get through the project. I do my final demo of this is how it's going to work. All the key stakeholders are happy. Everyone signs off on it, and it's good. And that was the moment where I was like, I am no longer just a cloud engineer or like a junior. So like, I've done, it's almost like a baptism of fire, and I was able to sort of successfully get that project over the line. And I had to use programming skills. I had to use CI/CD skills. I had to use basically every skill I've ever developed. And this was where actually some of the projects I was doing on the side, because I was creating this app that, did stuff, and I had to use those technical skills, and I had to draw on all the stuff I did outside of work to be able to like make this a success. And so, yeah, that was definitely one of the scariest points. And
Wow.
luckily I was able to come through the other side.
Wow. No, that is incredible. I think this is an example of someone being thrown into the deep end and swimming. I mean, people get thrown into the deep end and sink,
Yeah.
but you got thrown into the deep end and it made you a much better engineer. It made you go from an engineer to an architect, truly. And that was the experience that kind of made you who you are. And I'm sure you took experiences from that moment as you went on in your career. And like I've spoken about similarly, like some of the first months of my career working in cloud as Azure administrator and being thrown in. And at the time, I was just like, yo, this is crazy. This is mad. But but when I look back, that is the time that I learned the most. So I don't want to be back in that place.
Yeah.
But I know what that has done for me. And this seems like a really similar situation.
Yeah, it happens all the time. And this is why I always encourage people to like do stuff to be always improving themselves outside of work. And look, have work-life balance, that's cool. But like if you've been doing things in your own time, when you're in those situations, it makes it less stressful, or at least you have more confidence of your ability. Whereas if you're just coming in fresh, it's infinitely worse, and you'll probably get through it, but it's we can talk about it now and like smile and stuff, but when you're in it, it's the most stressful thing. And yeah, it's tough. It's tough.
Wow, incredible story. Thank you so much, Fayomi. This has been a great episode, and to end off the episode, I wanted you to just shout out anything you'd want to share with the audience or plug.
Yeah, thank you. For those of you who are at the start of your career, so you're not working in the cloud industry or anything, and you're like, okay, how can I actually get that first job? I've created a free guide called the 3 Simple Steps to Your First Cloud Job. I'm sure the links will be in the description somewhere. Check that out. I also have a YouTube channel called the Cloud Career Mentor, where, we talk about tips and strategies on how to break into the cloud industry. I'm thinking I'm going to start bringing in more content about, okay, you're in the cloud industry. How can you become more senior? So similar to stuff we're talking about that now. Check that out. And yeah, I'm very active on LinkedIn, Fayomi. You can find me. And yeah, I think that's it. Check us out, Cloud Career Mentor.
Amazing. This has been an incredible episode, and I can't wait to release it. Can't wait for everyone to see it. Thank you so much, Fayomi, for joining me once again on Tech Certified Podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Amazing. And for the guests and the audience watching, we'll be back every week, so stay tuned.